Okay, we are live. So, this is Saturn Girl. And on March 20th, the sun is about to enter the sign of Aries, his exaltation. And you know what that means? Happy Vernal Equinox! This is a very important time of year. I mean, do we ever really enter Aries, or is it Aries that enters us? You know what I mean? But anyway, what is an equinox? What does it mean, and why is it important? Well, I will tell you. You see, the equinoxes are the times of the year where the days and nights are equal. The word equinox comes from Latin, equa nox, equal night, right? Day and night are balanced. Astronomically speaking, it's when neither the North or South Pole is tilted towards nor away from the sun, but rather is parallel in terms of axis, right? When we're at the solstices, one of the poles is tilted towards and the other away from the sun. So the summer solstice, right, in the northern hemisphere is where the North Pole's like doop, towards the sun, and the South Pole, like at the winter solstice, is like boop towards the sun. You see what I'm saying? And these were symbolic events in the solar cycle. And it's very important because it's the solar cycle that defines the zodiac. It's the foundation for astrology. And what I mean by that, I mean the alternation between light and dark over the course of the solar year is the foundational concept and the source of all meaning in astrology. The solstices and equinoxes were integral to ancient religions and their calendars. It followed the apparent journey of the sun through the zodiac as it waxed and waned in light, right? So Aries, the Aries equinox, is when day and night are equal, but the sun is ascending, right? Moving northwards. Now we know the sun doesn't actually move. The earth is orbiting the sun. This is all the apparent motion from earth, but we get symbolism from it, you see? So the apparent motion of the sun as it ascends towards the summer solstice, right? When the sun's light is the brightest, yes? And then the sun after that point begins to move southwards, right? Descending towards the Libra equinox, the autumn equinox, and then from there towards the darkest light at the winter solstice. Now, the whole alternation between light and dark, as I said, is the fundamental symbolism of astrology. It has to do with the central story of the zodiac. And what is that? Well, the symbol of light typically had to do with soul, spirit, and consciousness, whereas the symbolism of dark had to do with unconsciousness, form, matter, and desire. Therefore, the story of the alternation between light and dark has to do with our own development, our own consciousness, as it waxes and wanes and deals with the identifications, going back between matter and other conditioning circumstances, right? Most of what we take ourselves to be is merely just conditioning that we've acquired in life. The things that we identify with ultimately are not even us, and they die in the end. So, the symbolism of the zodiac and our charts, our birth charts, are essentially a map of what we're not. Therefore, the light is bringing consciousness to the darkness, that which is unconscious, that which is unseen. The sun was a symbol of consciousness. It was a symbol of God, right? The sun god was a major deity in the pantheons of many ancient religions. And therefore, the solstices and equinoxes took on a special importance and were seen as ritualistic events because of their analogical relationship to our own development. Now, what is all this? How can we summarize this? What is this whole realization identification spiral? It's initiation. And what is initiation? Well, for lack of a better term, it's the maturation of consciousness. It's us growing into ourselves, becoming more and more of what we actually are. It's not adding anything to you. It's stripping away more and more of what you're not. And those conditions represent what goes into the entire personal self. And it's the personal self that keeps us from seeing who and what we are and how things really exist. So, this Aries Equinox, it's the beginning of the zodiacal year. It represents an initiation of sorts because it initiates the cycle. We can see this time as a time of birth, a time of renewed motivation. We're being freed from the previous condition where the nights are dominating the days. It's at the Aries point, at the equinox, when darkness no longer dominates. We're no longer held by dense desire, material satisfaction, all these things that keep us chained and imprisoned on the wheel of fulfilling desires and then getting dissatisfied again. It's this endless back and forth of, and we don't have any control. So Aries marks the point where the sun is liberated from that sense of darkness and being controlled. And what's really interesting is we can take the whole symbolism here of the zodiac and we can superimpose it on the Christ story. Now, I was raised very Catholic, so it's easy for me to do. I can quote scripture like the devil. But this really helps for an illustration, no matter what, religious tradition you grew up in or whatever, you see, because ultimately I don't really believe in anything, but there are lessons and teachings within this that can help us in our own development. So it's that Aries point that represents the birth in Bethlehem, right? It's like the birth of Christ in you, the soul, yes? And what is the soul? Well, ideally, it's considered to be the fragment of the divine, that part of you which is of your source. And that part of you which is the door and the way back into your source. Because as Christ said, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? No one comes to the Father but through me. That's you, right? That's you, your essence. That's the way you get back to your source. By investigating your own sense of essence. And this is the point in the story where we're first born and we have the drive, we have the motivation, we have a sense of purpose. And we have an eye ahead to our maturity, right? To demonstrating what we can do with our realization. And this represents the first initiation, right? We can envision the zodiac, the zodiacal wheel, as consisting of major initiations associated with the solstices and equinoxes along the way. And as I previously said, initiation represents the maturation of our consciousness. And, as I said, it's dramatized for us in the Christ myth, which essentially is the story of all the sun gods, right? Because the idea is that the sun god goes through this cycle every year, and that it's representative of the deepest parts of ourselves. So it's at the first initiation that we overcome material desire, right? Or, relatively, we're not so encumbered by it. We're not held back by it. Because typically, it's our material desires that govern our life. And it's not conscious. It's like, gosh, I'm hungry, gotta go eat, right? Ooh, I'm really horny right now. These desires arise and we act upon them because they govern our lives. And it's the first initiation represented by Aries, where we first demonstrate freedom from those desires. And we can make a decision about a certain direction, right? This is about direction. We set a pace and we set a course. And we're moving towards what? The summer solstice, the greatest light, where the sun is at its meridian of the year. It's like the noon of the year, the midday of the year. The sun is at its highest point. Now, astronomically, this is when the North Pole is tilted towards the sun, you see? And, astrology and its symbolism comes from the Northern Hemisphere, okay? So get the fuck over it. You're from Australia, okay? No one wants to hear you, okay, Aussies? I mean, there's lots more in the Southern Hemisphere, but it's always the Aussies that get all weird about this shit, No one in South America seems to get all weird about this like you people do. It's always the uppity Aussies. People in Old Zealand, they just don't care. They're too busy, kiwiing on their deeks with their eeks, right? You ever notice how Kiwis are always like, they don't have decks, they have deeks. They don't have eggs, they have eggs. And they don't have sex, they have seeks. You seeks with the e. Anyway, sorry. Whole nother thing. But then it brings us towards the summer solstice, where the light is at its brightest, right? And this is the point in the story where we reach maturity, where Christ begins his ministry. That's his work. That's his real work. His Dharma. And this is the point in the story where we also analogically begin to do our Dharma, right? Our duty in the world, our raison d'etre, right? Our so-called purpose, yeah? This is where we demonstrate our service. It's the point where we start to realize and sublimate our previous emotional desire, right? In the first initiation, it's the material desires. In the second initiation, it's overcoming the personal emotional desires. That which makes us feel good, that which we like, right? The sense of emotional volatility, of wanting, of passion. All these things need to be sublimated to a greater good. And it's through awareness of that greater good that we become motivated to do our Dharma and to do our work. We become aware of the greater urgency and need of others. Our personal little wills become more interested in the greater need, in, for lack of a better term, what we could call the greater will or the divine will, right? We become, our actions and our desires become more in line with that Dharma, right? And we can get a hint about what that Dharma is by looking at our rising sign. The quality of the rising sign, the finer qualities of the rising sign, indicate for us that Dharma, that service to be rendered, that duty we're supposed to do, just as Christ did. And it had to do with the revelation of love, right? We're overcoming the emotional self to a certain degree at this stage, the second initiation. But it's not like we don't have emotions and we don't have desires. It's that our emotions and our desires have to do with a much wider scope, and they're no longer personal. Or rather, they're less personal, because it's the personal desires that keep us from being able to contribute, being able to do our real work. Because it's only in losing sight of self that we're really able to be of service. Otherwise, What are we serving? We're serving desire. We're serving material acquisition. And we're serving the personal parts of ourselves, which aren't even us anyway. As I said earlier, the chart is a map of what you're not. So each of these stages or initiations are a progressive freeing ourselves from the condition of personal identification. And this is the story of initiation. So it's at that point, the greatest light in Cancer at the summer solstice, that we also glimpse the darkness. Because it's at this stage, almost immediately following the solstice, that the sun's light begins to wane, to decrease, as we move southwards then towards the fall equinox, the autumnal equinox. Libra. And what's Libra? Now, when we think of Libra, we often think of judgment, right? We think of decision, all that sort of thing. We think of balancing, right? The symbol of the scales tipping back and forth, weighing causes and events. Which is the way to go? Yeah? The realization of doing our duty shows us a greater purpose in life. And the sense of personal motivation and personal identification becomes more of a problem, more of an impediment to doing what we're supposed to do. So this is the point in the story as we reach Libra. The point in the story where Christ is judged, right? This is judgment. It's judgment because before this point, we're not able to make a decision. We're not able to make free choice because we haven't gotten that realization. After having shown ourselves and proved ourselves in service, then we become aware of the great pain and suffering and need of humanity because we're becoming empathetic to it. I don't mean some dumbass shit like, oh, empath. I'm an empath. That's bullshit. Don't believe that fucking nonsense, okay? Ugh, empath. I'm talking about we identify. We identify with the suffering of humanity. Their suffering becomes our suffering. And this sucks. It's not a fun place to be. It's a muddy middle ground between realizations where we're at war with the personal self on the one hand, and for lack of a better term, the greater self that really isn't self, but rather the relationship between all selves. It's at this point where we're judged and condemned. Remember, Christ was condemned to death under Pontius Pilate. Now, what was his response to that? He said, you can't kill me. You can't kill me. I give up my life freely. I give it up for those I love because I'm aware of their great suffering, and their great suffering has become my suffering. And now I have the capacity from this realization to make a conscious choice, the conscious choice to descend into darkness, to descend into hell, to learn how to give up the sense of the personal self, not for my own sake, but for the sake of others. And remember, Christ said, no greater love has a person than this, that she should give up her life for her friends. And I'm not just meaning the simple little thing like, I'm giving up my life or some stupid martyrdom. This doesn't necessarily have to do with anything literal or physical. Rather, it has to do with our personal sense of investment in things, with inserting our sense of self into externalities and external conditions. What the stage reveals is that you were never personally separate from these other suffering people. And that's how you can empathize with their suffering. This represents the third initiation. Whereas the first was overcoming the sense of material scarcity and lack, material anxiety. And the second stage was overcoming the magnetism of desire and our sense of being dominated by emotion and feelings. We get freed from that. And this is the point where we get freed from our sense of fear, which is a mental limitation, mental conditioning. I keep fucking hitting my printer here and it's pissing me off. Mental limitation. That's what fear is. Right? Do you remember Dune, the movie Dune? He's like, fear is the mind slayer. But there's something to that. This is the point where we learn to use the mind rather than to be used by it. The mind is simply just a little, sort of like a rudderless boat upon a sea of emotion before this. Our mind is driven this way and that way just based on how we feel. And after we've gained a little bit of awareness and freedom from those emotional conditions, we get the opportunity to use our mind and to what? Make a conscious choice to descend, to choose to do our duty. And then what happens, right? Pontius Pilate judges us. We say, no, Pontius Pilate, only I can judge me. Only God can judge me. And I'm freely giving up my life, right? For the sake of others. Well, then the torture begins, doesn't it? All that not fun stuff, right? Do you ever have to go to church and do you ever see the stages of the cross, Those are stages of you. They're symbolic stages of your own journey. Hi, Shaima. How are you, sweetheart? I'm more filming this for me, This is more for a video that I'm doing about the equinox. But hi. Hi. Anyway. So we descend into darkness by our own conscious choice. We choose to descend because we know it's this path that does us the greater service to others. And it takes us where? To death. The place of death and crucifixion at the winter solstice. This is when the sun's light is at its dimmest and darkest. The sun has reached its lowest point on its arc over the cycle of a year. What's really interesting to note here is that the word solstice comes from Latin, just like equinox does. Sol meaning sun, and stisios meaning to stand still. So very literally, the word solstice means to stand still, right? Sun stands still. The sun stands still. And ancient people around the solstices used to say the sun stands still for 3 days. And you may recall from the Christ story, right? Christ is crucified. He dies. And he's sealed in his tomb for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, he rises again, right? To be resurrected. This is all symbolic. Because this is the point in the story where we sacrifice ourselves. And when I say sacrifice, I'm not merely talking about, we give ourselves up. Although we do, in a way, since die to ourselves. But to sacrifice means to make something sacred. And how do you make something sacred? You render it in such a condition to where it's able to receive divine impression. In other words, it's when you have the ability to be impressed by something higher than yourself. That is being sacred. This is the fourth initiation, which is also called the crucifixion, right? It's where everything is stripped away, even God. You may recall from the gospel story, right? Jesus is crucified on the cross, and he exclaims, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" It's when we feel like we are completely cut off from our source. We are the furthest from the light. This is death in the sign of Capricorn, ruled by Saturn, right? Saturn, Saturn, the Lord of Death. What's interesting about this is that, yeah, it's death. It's the lowest part of the sun cycle, when the light is the dimmest and we are the furthest from our creator, from our source, from the source of consciousness. But guess what? At that moment, at the moment the sun passes into Capricorn, just after that 3-day sojourn, right? The sun stands still for 3 days. We're sealed in our tomb for 3 days, right? Because we're so Christ-like. But it's after that point that the sun begins to move northwards once again to Aries, the place of rebirth and resurrection. It's almost immediately after the death that the sun's light begins to wax again, to increase towards the summer solstice, the greatest light. So this presents us with a lesson, right? What is the lesson of death? The death in Capricorn, right? The lesson of the fourth initiation here. The lesson of the zodiacal wheel. It's that God has never forsaken you. You've never been alone. You've never been forsaken. Divinity has always been here. It's always been you. It's ever present, and you couldn't see it because there's an artificial division between subject and object. There's an artificial division, and that artificial line is called the personal self. It's a misunderstanding. It's a symptom of a human brain trapped in an individual body. It's a misunderstanding about who you are. What we have to sacrifice, what has to die in Capricorn, is the self, the sense of self. Because it's only through losing sight of self that you can really see what must be done. And it's through that losing sight of self progressively that you also progressively identify more with others around you. Our realization should be that we were never forsaken, even when we seemed furthest from the light, furthest from our source. That even in your darkest moments, even the moments that have seemed like death, that have been the most terrible that you've experienced, even in those moments, Christ is still in you, the hope of glory. I don't mean Jesus Christ. I'm not talking about religious nonsense. I'm talking about you. When I say Christ in you, I mean your consciousness. I mean your soul. Because ultimately, there is no soul and there is no you. There just is. There just is. And empathy with others and empathy with human development comes from the realization of your intimate connection with all others, your relationship to the rest of existence. The sense of separation was a misunderstanding, and that's the real heresy. It's not using the Lord's name in vain. It's the sense of being separate which engenders hatred. The realization is that love is ever present. And you can only realize love when there's nothing left to love. Because there's no boundary between the lover and the loved. That artificial boundary is removed from one's consciousness. And all that can be seen as love, even in the darkest moment. Because it's all that's there, ultimately. Forms come and go. Events come and go. Everything is constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly dying, constantly arising, only to pass away. But what's the ever-present background? What's that background upon which everything else happens? That's what you have to discern. That's what you have to investigate. And it only comes from investigating your own sense of self, of consciousness, of being you, of being here. Because when you go and you look for long enough, and you look with the right intensity and the right kind of eyes, you'll see it was never there in the first place. And that's joy, fear, hatred, sadness, depression, despond. These come from a fundamental misunderstanding that we are at stake, that the personal self is in danger at any moment. It is in danger. And you need to put it in danger of disappearing. Just like one of my gurus, Nisargadatta, famously said, the reward of self-knowledge is freedom from the personal self. And that is the purpose which we are here for. The purpose for which we are here is to realize the nature of self in order that it can be let go of, so that it no longer is a hindrance to us being of service to humanity in the world in some way, that we can participate in encouraging the development of others, not by imposing or impeding their own journey, but by being available and being able to share our own revelations and make them fruitful to others. Because sometimes we can point the way. We can be like a little lamp or a little lantern or a little flashlight in the dark. And everyone else has the opportunity to be the same to someone else. We have people in our lives who shine a little light in the dark for us, don't we? But ultimately, it's only through our own sense of self that we can understand anyone else's. So, for this Aries Equinox, I would love for you to cultivate a sense of renewed motivation, a new sense of direction, a sense of who you want to be, a new renewed sense of effort to become more conscious, to be more aware, to pay more attention to others and not just hide out in your head all day, and to be a participant in world affairs, in people's lives, and to be of service. And ultimately, being of service means fostering other people's conditions for realization. When people are starving and hungry and, unable to pay for medical care, they're not really able to do any of this stuff, are they? That's why the first initiation in Aries should be number one in our minds right now. What are people's material needs that hold them back from being able to do their own work in the world? How can we participate in alleviating the material suffering of others. Ultimately, this is a big question that people can't tackle individually. You need the work of governments and politics and all these sorts of things and economics. Therefore, it's everyone's duty to see what they can do to make a dent. And remember at this time, do what you can to alleviate people's material suffering, even if it means something small, right? Handing a blanket to someone who might be on the street, buying someone food, even just giving them money, That's just where my mind goes initially. But you see, this Aries Equinox time should be a time for you to cultivate direction. And just know that you're human. You're going to fail. You're going to stray from your own little track in your path. But what the gravity of this journey of the sun should show us is that it's never that far to get back on track. And you will be dragged kicking and screaming if you don't choose to go your own way. Because astrology teaches us that life is about fate, right? Most things just happen to us, so we don't have a choice. But what really matters is the capacity to choose in the moment how we're going to respond to the events that befall us in life. So there are three lessons. There are three lessons that we're sort of taught through this symbolism of the zodiac and the symbolism of light and dark. Number one, it shows us that we have conscious and unconscious parts in ourselves that are symbolized for us through light and dark and the increase and decrease in light over the zodiac. Number two, it shows us that our work is to bring light to that which was dark, to make the unconscious conscious. Our goal is redemption, to redeem, to bring that which was dead back into life. Not for our own sake, but for the sake of others. And number three, it shows us that we can only do that by freeing ourselves from the personal self through self-knowledge and self-training. In those 3 points, we have the essential purpose of astrology. Right? Remember that the chart is a map of what you're not. And our duty here is to realize what we are and to put that realization to work. So, do me a favor and get the fuck to work. I love you.